Welcome back to Hazel's Flight School. I'm Max,
I'm Lily.
and today we are looking at Ironton Distillery's whiskeys, kind of taking advantage of the fact that they've got a very good spread of different styles of whiskey so that we can describe how to read the labels of the different styles. But first, we've got a new addition for us, not new to the world. We're using Glencairns, which are the official tasting glass of whiskey. Anytime you see those competitions or anything that people are getting judged for their spirits, this is the official glass, and there's a reason why. We've got a nice bowl and a converging rim that focuses aroma. The bowl is there so that you can swirl around your spirit and warm it up easily with your hand. As we talked about in the last episode, it is kind of customary to warm it to slightly above room temperature just to be able to smell and taste it better. Yeah, and you can tell you don't have to stick your nose all the way in it like you would with a wine glass. It really does kind of let the aroma come straight out the top. So we're starting out with Ironton's Straight Malt Whiskey. Now, Ironton Distillery is based in Denver. They're using 100% Colorado grown barley, which is really cool. They're malting it in-house and aging it in-house as well. So this is a true expression of grain to glass whiskey made all here in Colorado.
Is grain that is used in whiskey malted in the same way it is for beer?
Absolutely. Oftentimes, you will find that in the malting process for a whiskey, because there's the additional process of distillation, you tend to mess with it a little more. You tend to smoke your barley or do a really heavy roast, something that would produce a stout for a beer. You could make a very kind of chocolatey whiskey with it. But there's a lot of different ways you can malt your barley. I don't know if we talked about the malting process, but as far as it goes with whiskey, anytime you see malt on the label, they're referring to that same grain, that malted barley. So this is 100% malted barley, aged in new American oak, and you can tell that it's new American oak because it says straight on the label. Do you remember what else was in straight? We talked about it briefly last time.
It's the water amount added?
Not quite. If the whiskey says straight on the label, you are not allowed to add color. You are not allowed to add sugar. The only additive allowed is water. Yeah.
I got the water part.
You had it, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of the other rules for straight whiskey, which we'll go over very briefly because they get technical and kind of boring. You have to put it into a barrel off of the still at no more than 62.5% alcohol by volume and no less than 50% alcohol by volume. And within that range, that is what whiskey is. And it's the difference between a whiskey and a vodka. Remember, the proof that it comes out the still of. So these guys are putting it into a barrel at no more than 62.5% alcohol by volume, and they're using a brand new, never previously used American oak barrel, which is one more rule about being able to put something as a straight whiskey. So no added color, no added sugar, only additive allowed is water. It must be aged for a minimum of 2 years. All those rules about proof on barrel entry and new American oak. And that last one's really important because all of our barrels that we use in the whiskey production process, once they're done at Buffalo Trace or Maker's Mark, where they make an ocean of whiskey, those barrels go all over the world and everyone else uses them. So you'll often see on a Scotch label, first fill American oak. They're using something that likely came from Jack Daniels or one of the massive distilleries in Kentucky. Yeah. So, straight malt whiskey, we're going to try it out. And one of the coolest things about malt whiskey as a style is that you kind of nailed it on the head when you were talking about beer earlier. You really just make a beer with a couple different yeast choices and fermentation choices, and then you chuck that beer into the still. And you can make a malt whiskey pretty easily that way. Not easily, it still takes a fair amount of skill. But yeah, so let's move on to the bourbon. All right, so this is a Colorado straight bourbon. The difference between bourbon and whiskey is a question I get asked all the time. Take a stab at it. Hit me.
All whiskey is not bourbon, but all bourbon is whiskey.
Absolutely correct. Because whiskey is just a distillate of fermented grain. Bourbon has additional rules, and one of those additional rules is what the recipe of it is. Must be a majority corn is the biggest one, but also must be made in the U.S., not just Kentucky, as some people would like to tell you. Any bourbons made within the U.S. can legally put their name on as bourbon. There have been a couple times where people tried to put bourbon on their label and they weren't produced in the U.S., and they had to pull that label off of our shelves at one point. It was pretty crazy. The other things that bourbons tend to do, because corn as a majority grain is actually kind of light and sweet, and if we smell and taste this one, probably might pick up on it, especially when compared to the malt whiskey. But
Definitely sweeter.
right?
Yeah.
And so that sweetness is because corn makes high fructose corn syrup. It's very starchy. You've got a lot of sugar to it. So in order to flavor it more and not just have it be a sweet whiskey with some oak, you tend to use a mixture of different grains. And all the differences between bourbons, while it may seem narrow by just having a majority corn being the rule, is what percentages of which grains you're using. So we like to say things like high rye content bourbon or low rye content bourbon or wheated bourbon. And that's all in reference to the secondary grains, usually rye, sometimes wheat, often a little bit of barley, because barley has a lot of good enzymes that helps all of your fermentation go more smoothly. But really what's important is 35% rye after majority corn means that there's very little space for wheat to give you much flavor. There's very little space for barley to really influence the flavor, but it's there. I tend to view wheat as a more like textural element, some creaminess, some butteriness maybe. And then rye I tend to think of as having a fair amount of spice, but we'll see that really exemplified on the next one. What did you think? Any tasting notes on this one?
We haven't tasted this.
Oh, well, geez.
Did you taste it?
No.
Oh.
I've had it before though.
Of course.
But yeah, for me, this is just a really lovely straight bourbon. It does all the things that I ask a bourbon to do. I want a bourbon to have some sweetness. I want a bourbon to have some spice. And I want to get both the oaky characteristics of vanilla and caramels and maybe even some darker sugars like brown sugar, molasses. But I also want it to have grain quality to it. And what a lot of craft whiskeys do that a lot of the bigger guys don't do is they really exemplify the grain. And you can tell that this is a product made from grain. Yeah.
I think for me, the taste was broken down into 3 parts. Smell-wise, definitely sweeter.
Yeah.
On the palate, you get some spice, not quite as much. So a little bit of a silkier texture, and then aftertaste, you're definitely seeing that spice come through and a heavier, more grainy textural element.
Yeah. And the last thing that I always tell people when I'm talking about the science of taste and how we taste things with spirits, texture. Texture is a big thing. Whenever you're tasting a spirit, think about the way it hits the front of your tongue, the middle of your tongue, the back of your tongue, and also on the exhale, that finish after you've swallowed a little bit of it or spit it out, and get that exhale, that finishing note, if it lingers, if it's around, what quality is it of? But those textures are the big things that really tell you if a whiskey has been well matured, is fully complex and nuanced. Yeah, let's move on to the rye. All right, so in front of us now, we have Ironton's straight rye whiskey. This is a kind of unique mash bill for a rye because it's 65% rye of 2 different malts. There's a pale malt and a chocolate roast, and then 35% barley. Oftentimes when you get like bullet rye, you remember what the number is on bullet? It's
No.
right on the front. It's a 95 in a circle. They're saying that it's 95% rye and 5% barley. We call that a Pennsylvania style rye. These ryes that are coming out of the craft scene lately are much lower in rye content than that 90-95%, and they're much higher in other grains. This one is really bringing out a lot of the malt And yeah, it's a really kind of lovely. I don't want to lead you on tasting notes, but there's something that I always get from this one that I am hoping you pick up on. But yeah, so we were talking about like the spice that we had on the bourbon before. This one ought to have more spice because that majority corn has been replaced by a majority rye. And rye as a grain is also a bit drier. Not going to have as much of the kind of round sweetness. There's going to be more of that kind of almost a bready grain thing going on. But yeah, I'm a big fan of ryes in general, and they've seen a really big boost lately. People are getting into them.
I definitely get more spice in the smell of this one, not having tasted it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Let's see what you think. Now, in order to be a rye whiskey, I kind of glossed over this, but bourbon, majority corn, rye whiskey, majority rye. You can make a malt whiskey and have it be just a majority malt, and we spoke about that briefly with Spirit Hound last time. But this one is 100% malt, and there's a new designation of American single malts that's in the works that hopefully will codify that.
This one, for me, much spicier on the palate. Similar aftertaste between these two, I would say, but the rye becomes very apparent in this immediately, where it's dialed back in this one.
Yeah. And once you have a breakdown like this of this one being mostly rye and then a bit of barley, and this one being mostly corn and a bit of all the other ones, and this one being 100% malt, you start to be able to pick out the influence when they're all combined together. Well, that spice is coming from this grain. So it's really a treat to be able to do a breakdown like this and try them all in a row and see the different expressions different grains give you. Let's move on to the cask strength malt.
Going like in order of amount of malt, basically?
Kind of. We're actually going in order of proof. All right, so we are on the cask strength malt. And you asked a good question about what order are we doing these in? Why this order in particular? Because we went from a malt to a bourbon to a rye and then back to a malt. Mm-hmm. That's because this malt is 60% alcohol by volume, whereas the other ones I think are all sitting around the 50% mark.
Yeah.
And at 60% alcohol by volume, that means that 40% of what's in there is not alcohol, right? It's going to be pretty potent stuff. Whenever you are drinking many spirits in a row, if you have no idea what any of them are going to taste like, your best kind of gauge is to go from the lowest proof to the highest proof. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that break that rule, because if we had tried like an ouzo before this, all we would taste would be anise.
What's an ouzo?
We'll get to that sometime. Okay. Greek liqueur, very fun.
I like Greece.
So this malt whiskey, 60% alcohol by volume, cask strength, and 4 years at the minimum of age. So this is twice as old at the minimum than the other three that we've tried.
Does aging a whiskey longer, does that impacts the strength of the flavors, is that correct?
Yes and no. You'll actually find that the longer a whiskey is aged, the more subtle and nuanced it becomes. If you have a 30-year-old scotch and you have that same scotch at 10 years of age, it's going to be really bright and punchy, very robust in flavor. Whereas at 30 years of age, it's going to be very soft, lots of complexity, but much more of that nuance and elegance and balance. So let's try this cask strength malt. Oh, there's a smell I get. It's like cherries.
Can taste the 60%.
Yeah. Your eyes are watering, yeah.
Just a little bit.
So one of the other questions I often get asked, and this is a really good time to address it, is do you water your whiskey? Should I add water in my whiskey? For you, because you don't often drink things that are 60% alcohol, and we'll leave it unsaid whether I do or not, I would add a fair amount of water in here. And easiest way to do it, you can use tap water. Some people will tell you not to, but we're in Colorado. We got pretty good tap water. And just add a little bit at a time and let it mix around and see what notes you can pull out of it. Because at 60%, if you're not used to it, it's just going to taste like alcohol.
I think I would add water to this if I was drinking it just at home, because there are such great notes of like some vanilla and some caramel in here, a little bit of like cocoa, but I was a little overwhelmed.
It's definitely pretty potent stuff. One of the other ways, if you don't have any water to hand, one, go find water, but two, you can just sit and nurse your whiskey. Swirl it around, air it out, warm it up a little bit, and that will help tame it down and pull out more notes than just alcohol as well. And that's really all we have about these whiskeys. A great thank you to Jakim Noske of Classic Wines for bringing us these Ironton whiskeys. Thank you to Ironton for being an awesome craft distiller in Colorado.
Thanks for flying with us today. Subscribe to Hazel's Beverage World on YouTube and ask your questions in the comments.